Hey there, everyone, and welcome. I'm Errol Barnett, broadcasting to you from my home office here in Manhattan. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. A lot of big stories to get to for you right now. And we begin with President Trump turning a Rose Garden address at the White House Tuesday into an apparent campaign speech. The president began his remarks by announcing an executive order and legislation targeting China over its treatment of Hong Kong. But then Mr. Trump launched into a series of attacks on Joe Biden over the former vice president's policies related to China, trade, the economy, immigration, and law enforcement, among others. Joining me now to discuss all of that and more are Major Garrett and Natalie Brand. Major, of course, is our CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Natalie is at the White House. Thanks to you both for being with us. Major, let's begin with you. This presidential address felt like a bit more of a campaign speech, as they do with President Trump. But from what I was able to see, the president's demeanor appeared to be slightly more subdued. What was your major takeaway from what happened Tuesday?
You know, subdued, letting off some steam, but clearly trying to draw contrast with the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. And the president doesn't have rally space to do this anymore. So he chose a Rose Garden event. And there are those who have been advising the Trump campaign who say, look, the president's got to find more ways to more frequently draw campaign contrasts with Joe Biden. And doing events at the White House, being presidential, helps, but it doesn't get him the kind of traction among his supporters that taking really hard, aggressive shots at the ideological or policy differences or political differences between him and his administration and the Biden campaign and other like-minded Democrats has to happen, and it has to happen as frequently as possible. Now, the president wanted to have a campaign rally this weekend, this Saturday, in New Hampshire, but they had to cancel it. Yes, they were afraid of small crowds. They were also afraid of the weather, but be that as it may, whatever the combination of reasons, no rally. So the president has to find ways, and he's desperate to find ways, to draw these sharp contrasts. Now, the top of the remarks did deal with substantive issues, and in the vernacular of our times, don't sleep on China. And this entire policy scrape going on between the Trump administration and the Chinese government. Hong Kong is in the middle of it. The Hong Kong Accountability Act was passed unanimously or nearly unanimously in Congress, and the executive order eliminating U.S. preferences for Hong Kong. It's a serious national security and foreign policy issue. And the president used that as a platform to show, from his perspective, how tough he's been on China. That's going to be a campaign issue. That's a legitimate point of either friction or conflict or at least discussion in the country. And a lot of Republicans are looking for something else besides the pandemic or police reform to talk about, and most of them, looking at their internal polls, just as the White House is falling back on China. China is someplace that many conservative Republicans view askance, skeptically, if not hostilely, and China's bungling, intentionally or otherwise, of the early stages of the coronavirus give all of that messaging exactly the kind of punch the president wants and Republicans want to have. So, yes, it was a campaign event done by a president in the Rose Garden acting presidentially. But that signals to us a couple of things. The policy contrasts are real. It's important. Two, the president understands that he has got to get combative and draw contrasts with Joe Biden, and as soon as possible. Why? Because whatever he says about him not believing polls showing him behind, actions like this afternoon, hastily called press conference full of political attack lines, tells you the White House, the Trump re-election campaign is nervous about what those polls say, knows they are roughly consistent with their own internal polls, and have to get back in this race.
Yeah, never underestimate the power of the presidential podium, which typically allows incumbents to coast to re-election. What also allows that to take place is a good economy. History tells us when the economy is doing well, presidents can ride that to re-election. The president did tout some of his economic achievements. His rival, former Vice President Joe Biden, released his economic plan late last week, $2 trillion climate plan earlier on Tuesday. Natalie, are the president and his campaign, I'm wondering, growing concerned about campaigning on an economic message as planned, or do they still see that as a winnable message?
Well, Errol, you could hear some of that in the president's comments just in the last hour in the Rose Garden, because he took sharp aim at Biden, as we've been talking about, specifically the climate plan that the presumptive Democratic nominee unveiled today, releasing 2 plans for a clean energy future and committing to 2035 as a carbon-free power sector with millions of jobs dedicated to this clean energy future. The president said today that this is a hardcore crusade against American energy, accused Biden of being part of the radical left, invoking the name of progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and taking, again, sharp aim at his energy plans. We also heard the president criticize Biden's economic plan last week, even accusing him of plagiarizing some parts of it, because Biden was speaking about ramping up manufacturing jobs and infrastructure and dedicating trillions of dollars to new efforts to promote new jobs along these lines. And we know that Biden is campaigning in some of these key Rust Belt states, using Pennsylvania and Scranton, his hometown, to talk about his economic message. That, of course, being a key state this election cycle. It was a key state last election cycle that the president carried. So we can see, based on where these events are taking place, there is a fierce battle for not only these battleground states, but the constituencies that both of these candidates will be vying for, and the presumptive Democratic nominee trying to cut into some of that support that carried President Trump in 2016. When you look at the types of voters from labor workers and manufacturing workers, and some of the key groups that will be so critical this time around.
We're also hearing and watching President Trump continue to push his effort to reopen schools this fall. He was asked about that by our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge, in an exclusive interview Tuesday afternoon. I want you both to just listen to that exchange.
The Los Angeles School District is the latest and one of the largest in the country to say they're not going back to school in the fall.
Mistake.
What do you tell parents and teachers who feel that it's unsafe to go back?
I would tell parents and teachers that you should find yourself a new person, whoever's in charge of that decision, because it's a terrible decision. Because children and parents are dying from that trauma too. They're dying because they can't do what they're doing. Mothers can't go to work because all of a sudden they have to stay home and watch their child, and fathers. What's happening? You know, there's a tremendous strain on that whole side of the equation.
So it's a balancing act.
It is a balancing act, but we have to open our schools. I also say a decision like that is politics, because we're starting to do very well in the polls, because I'm for law and order. I'm for strong business. Our jobs are coming back at a record level like we've never seen anything like it, record level. We're heading up. It's turning out to be the V, just like I built it once before, the strongest economy ever. I'm doing it again. And they don't want that to happen, because they think
who's the they?
They is the Democrats.
Major, why do you think President Trump is choosing to focus on this as a political issue, despite polling suggesting that reopening schools fully is an unpopular idea?
Right. Americans are anxious. Right now, they don't know what the best science is. They don't know what the best preparation is. They don't know how to imagine what school looks like. Is it every other day? Is some of it online? Are their children spaced out? Do they eat their lunch at their desks? All these things are new. And it creates, with each and every new idea and concept that is being debated, thought about, in every school district in the country, a lot of uncertainty. And into that uncertainty, the president plunges headlong. Don't worry about it. Go back to school. Well, that doesn't answer a lot of the questions that parents and teachers have about how do you weigh the risks? How do you mitigate them? How do you achieve the things that everyone wants to achieve? Get back to school, have a good education for the children, have a good social environment for them, but also make sure the parents are not worried sick about their kids being at school, or teachers aren't worried sick about whatever the children might be bringing into the class. There's just a lot of worry. The president wants to essentially suppress that worry and say, no, go back to school. And we're going to incentivize you at the federal level, or we're going to threaten you at the federal level if you don't do what we want. Now, Errol, that's a whole other philosophical vast shift for Republicans and so-called conservatives, who have always said local control should dominate decisions on schooling. No longer. They're all in favor now of the federal government pressing down and saying go back to school. Why does the president care about this? Well, politically, it gives him a contrast with many teachers' unions, which have historically been aligned with the Democrats. No question about that. But it also goes to a much deeper economic imperative for the president. He mentioned it a second ago. If parents can't go back to work because their children are home taking education online, that makes it more difficult to have a V-shaped economic recovery, the kind the president knows he needs in the fall to give himself a credible and bankable re-election message. I rebuilt the economy. We're on the worst. We've seen the worst of the pandemic. Stick with me. If schools are not open and all this uncertainty and this worry persists, all of that is complicated. The president wants to attribute all of that to politics, but there are plenty of parents across this country, and the polls indicate this. They're not being dictated to by the teachers' unions. They're just asking basic common sense questions. What's safe? What isn't? What is the risk? How to mitigate it? They want the best for their children's education, and lots of parents have learned that teaching from home or working with their children online is complicated as well. They sort of figured it out late spring, but there's some trepidation about that. So yes, parents would like to have their kids back at school if it can be found, or at least it can be found to their satisfaction, to be a reliably safe and continuously safe environment. Those are two great variables. And the president sort of wants to suggest all those variables, or thinking about those variables, are irresponsible. And last point, Errol, telling people in Los Angeles, oh, replace the heads of your school district, that can't happen. You have to deal with the decisions made and interact with the people who are making those decisions. Telling parents, oh, just replace the head of the school board, doesn't do them anything. It doesn't help them at all. It's not responsive to anything that is practical or doable in the here and now.
You know, it's interesting as you use the phrase suppressing the worry, because I imagine that another leg of this suppressing the worry bull, to use a really terrible analogy, might be the discrediting of Dr. Anthony Fauci. The members of the administration criticizing him for his statements on the pandemic, the president retweeting conspiracy theories about the outbreak, and you have a top aide, Dan Scavino, sharing, I think we have the post to show viewers, something really mocking Dr. Fauci, leading to, what he says, leading to the canceling of the NFL season and other things. So, Natalie, I'm just wondering from you, how do Republicans and the president's allies feel about this criticism of what we all pretty much agree is an unbiased medical expert who served presidents on both sides of the aisle?
Errol, the federal government's leading infectious disease expert and someone who has been widely respected by both Republicans and Democrats for decades. Now, just today, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the president's own closest congressional allies, defended Dr. Fauci and seemed to speak out against some of this discrediting that's been going on, and said that any effort to undermine Dr. Fauci is not going to be productive, quite frankly. He said he's been around a long time. He's one of the smartest people I know. He said he respects him. This is a trusted public health leader. And he said again that this effort to speak out against him is not going to move the ball forward, especially when we have a number of states that are seeing surges in cases and state leaders saying they need more protective equipment and personnel and testing supplies and help in dealing with this resurgence that we are seeing in states, particularly in the Sun Belt. So again, these were strong words from Senator Graham, who, again, typically defends the president, but in this case, he did kind of, in a way, give a rebuke in terms of what's going on. from White House officials attacking Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, again, as I mentioned earlier, his history here in Washington goes back decades. You may remember there was a presidential debate in the late 1980s where former President George H.W. Bush was asked who was an American hero to him, and he pointed to Dr. Fauci in that clip that has since resurfaced as this has become such a trusted voice during the entirety of this pandemic, and someone who continues to appear in various online forums and podcasts. Just today, speaking at an online forum held by Georgetown University. Errol.
Very interesting stuff. Major Garrett and Natalie Brand, we appreciate both of you joining us. I'm sure you're much better at me in coming up with analogies than, suppressing the worry bull. I'll leave that to both of you. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks. You got it.